Hi, everybody. Wow. I can kind of see that you're out there. My name is Scott Cullen. I work for the Grace Communications Foundation, and I have the privilege of moderating this esteemed panel of experts. I get to pretend like I'm one, but not really one. The issue of communicating, and especially around true cost accounting, is a challenging one. And so I think it's important to kind of get some perspective around these issues. And if you try to talk about true cost accounting, you'll invariably get into the idea of cost and how much food is going to cost. And so it's a difficult issue to communicate around. And food and ag issues, as they become more mainstream and more attention is being paid to sustainable ag, the need to better communicate on these issues is huge. And so we've got some really interesting perspectives on that being done and some real experts. So first we're going to hear from Douglas, who is going to give some background and some case studies.
So we don't have a remote, so I'm going to be constantly going back here to click on this computer. I'm with the Lexicon of Sustainability, and I want to talk a little bit today about the storytelling tools that people use when they actually want to activate, when they want to shift the needle, when they want to create behavior change. Our personal motivation began when we actually had a food company. We had a goat milk ice cream company. And it was really impossible in the limited real estate of an ice cream package to explain all the things that we were trying to do, working with local farmers, and also consumers. Even if we could explain those things, consumers didn't know what they meant. And so we thought, what if we created a lexicon of sustainability? If we captured all those terms that people didn't know, find the foremost expressors of those ideas, and then brought those ideas to a larger audience. So we literally went around the United States for 5 years and assembled this lexicon. And at times, using even complex principles. So having Dr. Elaine Ingham explain what the soul food web is, or having Nicolette Nyman and Bill Nyman explain to us what antibiotics and what their use is in cattle production. Out of that journey, which resulted in hundreds and hundreds of images, we created this taxonomy of the words that people talk about when they talk about food. One of those, I'll just give you an example, like food waste, for example. We went around the country looking at everything from gleaning to food rescue to movements to actually capture fallen fruit in communities across the country, composting, the idea of eating nose to tail. And we not only made these images, but then we also said, how are we going to get them out into the world? So we literally allowed anybody in the United States to come to our site and actually fill out an application, and then we would send them an entire show of 24 images and turn them into curators in their communities, with the only caveat being they couldn't be a curator and they couldn't show it in a museum or a gallery. So what we've had happen in the last few years is literally 1,000 shows in every conceivable place you can imagine. Ironically, the one at the bottom left is actually where we're holding this event today, but that was at the Slow Money Conference, I think 2 years ago here. But upper left is a street fair in San Antonio. The middle top is South Central Los Angeles in an elementary school. The bottom center is a climate conference in New York, in Central Park. We also allow you to go to our website and download the images and paint them, have painting parties, wheat paste them. We even give you recipes for how to make wheat paste. Come on in. Okay. And you can get them with or without words. People sometimes add like that, their own definitions. You can even get them in Spanish. We also make films. This is a film I won't play, but it is a film about food waste, that part of our PBS series of short films that we do to explain a lot of these core ideas. We also, on the web, created the lexiconoffood.com, where we created this taxonomy and created a holding place for all these ideas where other people could add to it as well. You can see that food waste is one of them. And if you were to click on food waste, you'd have, for example, you'd have Dana Gunders from NRDC explain to you what food waste is, and you'd have a series of articles, and there's even something we do called the food list, where we then push it out on the web to the thousands of people that subscribe to the Lexicon, and they get articles. What comes out of looking at food waste is this idea, for example, as I mentioned, this idea of eating nose to tail. And one of those things about eating nose to tail is that it's one of those ways to eat the whole animal and to reduce food waste. As a content maker, I'm always concerned about information waste. The idea that if I'm going to travel 3,000 miles to go on a fishing boat in the Pacific, I don't want to go there all that way and just make a couple of pictures. I want to go that way, and I want to capture video to make films. I want to do interviews, or I can turn them into podcasts. I'm always thinking about how I can create content that can be specific to a million different audiences, because we are so fragmented. We have to find people and take the content to where they are gathering, both on the web and in the real world. So we really consider ourselves at the Lexicon to be platform agnostic. We try to get our words out to as many places as possible. I just want to show you 3 quick case studies of how that works. In Arkansas, we chose Arkansas as a way to explain the challenges that factory farms present in communities, especially for clean water. And I heard somebody an activist in Arkansas where Cargill put a cave right there in the Ozarks, that a hog makes as much waste as 6 to 8 people. And I thought, wow, that's a really visible, very visual thing. So we went to Arkansas. We found the closest town to this hog cave well, and we spent time with the people at the waste treatment plant, documented that with them. Then we met with hydrogeologists who were studying all of the water near this cave well. And then we gathered all of these people from the community that had risen up, and we gathered all their stories. What comes out of that is a film, of course, and those information artworks you saw, but also really now we've changed what we do at Lexicon. We now really try to work really closely with people who are on the ground and give them those storytelling tools that they can actually use in their communities. So aside from our film, which comes out at the end of May, and all these information artworks that we're giving to the community to distribute in shows, we're also making e-cards that we wrote with those people that explain all of these principles. This is what happens after you flush your toilet, what happens when a factory farm goes to the bathroom. You just see all these different stories that they're telling. Trying to take all of these ideas and put them in as many different platforms as possible. In Iowa, we're fortunate to have Bill Stoke at the conference this week, and I'm not sure how many of you know about the Des Moines Water Works lawsuit, if I can just get a show of hands. Interesting lawsuit. The city of Des Moines is suing 3 upstream counties for putting nitrates that are running off from those farms that end up in the drinking water in Des Moines. They have one of the largest nitrate removal facilities in the world, and Bill Stoke decided to do something about it. So drinking water is a very challenging subject in that state. To do something a little bit different, we actually took our education program and we took 82 high school students from Ames High School in Iowa, and we said, what if we take them by bus around the entire state? What if we take them to the places, the point sources where this pollution is happening that is at the basis of this lawsuit? And what if we take them to the drainage ditches, which are really where is what is delivering these the water into these waterways? And what if we actually teach them how to make the same kinds of information artwork that we make, so they can tell the story themselves? This is an information artwork that's made by a 16-year-old that had never used a camera or didn't even really know what Photoshop was, to explain a saturated buffer. This is another to explain a riparian buffer. Believe it or not, a student who is 16 explaining the Haber-Bosch process. And it goes on and on and on. What's amazing about this journey that these kids went on is that they explained the challenges and the solutions to this problem very eloquently. And then, of course, they're now doing shows. After their first show, within 7 days, they were invited to come to the state capitol. And this is a show that they actually just did just last week in the state capitol for policymakers in the state. When the trial, when the case goes to trial in August, those kids are going to be directly across the street with a show, so that when people are arguing that this is a case that's too complicated for the public to understand, there'll be 80 high school students from Ames who beg to differ. And of course, it comes with films and a whole e-card campaign, a social media campaign, so that we can really hit as many different spots as possible. The last case I'd like to talk about is in Malls, Italy. First community in the world that actually succeeded in outlawing pesticides. They did it with a referendum. What was amazing about the story is that it takes place in a place that people normally associate with the Iceman. This man that was found in the 1990s, that is 5,000 years old, and when they did DNA samples of his stomach, they found out what he had eaten for his last meal, and ironically, the same foods are grown in that remote valley 5,000 years later. That was until climate change warmed up this valley and apples were introduced. It's now the densest growth of apple, of the most densest production of apples in all of Europe is in this one area. Since apples are sold without blemishes, it also results in a high degree of pesticides. People with no background, no understanding of how to mobilize. We're talking about beauticians, we're talking about high school teachers, pediatricians, pharmacists, all got together and created a manifesto and actually decided to take on these interests. And the result is a project that we're now working on with these people to tell their story. That again will be with films, will be artworks. We have an article in Rodale's Organic Life that comes out in a few weeks. And the way that we look at things at the Lexicon is that you cannot think of your messaging as just one particular platform. We always think of it as many, many platforms. You have to find people where they are. Thank you.
So next we're going to hear from David Mermin, who's a pollster and has been doing an amazing project surveying the attitudes of folks around the country, and so we're going to hear what they've learned.
Great. And while they're setting me up, let me give full credit well, it's amazing to be on this panel. It's fascinating to be at here at the conference. And but this research really mostly conducted by two of my partners on the East Coast. So Linda Lake is the president of our firm, Alicia Snow. And but as our West Coast partner, I'm here to cover for you, to describe for you what we learned in this really remarkable project where we were taking a look, and frankly, one of the most in-depth looks that's been done on where sort of where the public, the American public is on sort of just broad understanding of food policy and food issues in the country. And what we're trying to do is, of course, build a food movement, and a lot of this conference is about that. But we have to understand where we're starting. Where is it that people are in terms of their attitudes and beliefs and understanding of these issues? So with this, the research I'm showing you comes from a set of focus groups we did, 6 focus groups around the country, different demographics of voters, just having a discussion, understanding where people are coming from, what they responded to in terms of food issues, what their goals and priorities were, and then trying to understand and explore the language. How is it to communicate effectively about these issues and frame them so that they can be, you can actually communicate persuasively. And then from those focus groups did a national survey where we tested, again, measured some of the underlying attitudes, just to understand where people were starting, tested some messages to see how people responded to those and did they move public attitudes, and then measured the results. And frankly, fairly exciting in terms of the positive response that people are. There's a lot of, to use potentially a trite metaphor in this audience, it's sort of fertile ground for moving people and communicating with them. But it has to, the communication has to happen. It's not fully developed. You know, it's not like people are ready to, advocate and move on these policies, but they're certainly aware of some concerns, and this gives us a lot of opportunity. So in terms of these focus groups, again, there's a very rich set of findings that we got from these conversations with voters, but we found that just as people were talking about their own concerns, their own perceptions of what's going on with food in the country, they had some of the same concerns and priorities that we're hearing here at the conference. So that our food system is not meeting everyone's needs, that if they're subsidizing junk food, why can't they flip it and subsidize healthy food, a very simple conception of what we need to do. It needs to be a legislative push. There are policies and regulations that allow this stuff to happen. And that our children deserve a future where healthy food is accessible to everybody. And these are just regular people having conversations about these issues and giving us really powerful language that we can then use and explore for communications. So we found a number of things in terms of the perception. This is sort of, again, starting points where people are currently. And then we asked them to sort of give a grade of how we're doing as a country on some of these basic food issues. And so fundamentally, people think, we're doing pretty well in terms of just the availability of food in America. There's a lot of food available in our country. People give that a high rating, an A or a B, in terms of how we're doing. Availability of healthy food in America, not quite as good. People have more mixed views on that, although they still think it's mostly fairly available. But then we get down to a whole set of issues where people already perceive there are problems in our system, and they recognize that there's something that needs to be changed. Food safety, mixed, kind of a B or a C at best for most voters. The food system, the affordability of food in America, and this, one thing we have to always remember is that the people are, while we all recognize that food is cheap in our country and that that's in some ways problematic as well as positive, that people are worried that, look, we're a country where not everyone is equal, not everyone has the same resources, and we want to make sure that food is affordable to people. And particularly the affordability of healthy food is seen as something we're not doing very well on. Most voters rated that poorly for the country. And then the sustainability of agriculture, very mixed views on whether we're doing well at that as well. The strongest concerns that voters, and this is all now survey data, so we're measuring this, with a national survey, accurate to plus or minus 3% of the attitudes of the whole country. And we asked, we listed or we read to people a whole series of particular issues within the food system and asked how concerned they were about them. And we're looking for, because if you're going to move somebody and engage them on an issue, you have to start with what are they concerned about, how can you connect to that, and then try to move your policy. So we found some simple facts like the fact that a third of children today will develop type 2 diabetes, extremely concerning to voters. 94% are concerned about that, 81% are very seriously concerned about it. The overuse of antibiotics in healthy farm animals leads to antibiotic-resistant diseases, making thousands of people sick each year. There are lots of reasons to be against excessive antibiotics in food. This happens to be a way of stating that problem that is particularly compelling to voters, so it reaches them. 74% very seriously concerned about that. 89% are concerned. Today's children are expected to live shorter lives than their parents, really a kind of a reversal of the historical pattern in our country, also of great concern to voters. And again, we tested a whole range of different things, but these were some of the things that they were most concerned or worried about. Several others that have to do with sort of policy in the country. In the last 3 months, the big food and agrochemical industries have spent $15 million lobbying members of Congress. There's an upswelling of concern generally about the influence of powerful interests and money in our politics and in our government. And we can connect that to food policy, and it can be a very powerful combination. Food and ag companies gave over $76 million in campaign contributions to members and candidates for Congress. That's a great concern. And then some things about subsidies. Again, it's not that voters knew these facts coming in, but they have an intuitive understanding that these are problems, and serious problems, when they're presented. But the federal government recommends a diet of 50% fruits and vegetables, while less than 1% of farm subsidies go toward fruits and vegetables. Very concerning. 80% of voters say that's a serious concern, 49% very serious. So these don't have quite the intensity of personal feeling that we saw on some of the health issues that were on the first slide, but they're very concerning to most voters. And the federal government does not provide enough support for sustainable farming practices. Again, about half the voters very seriously concerned, in large majority. So that is the sort of fertile ground. That's the receptivity, the perceptions that people have that suggest they're interested and willing to listen to communications on these issues. And then when you look at policies, this is again a starting point. This is where voters are right now in terms of their attitudes when we ask these questions. Do you favor or oppose limits on government subsidies to the largest farm businesses? A sort of very simplified, boiled down version of the kind of direction we might want to move food policy. Well, it's somewhat divided, but it is a slight majority, 50%, who are in favor of limiting those subsidies, 36% opposed. But that is a majority and an advantage that favor that change in policy. Much more of a majority, a much stronger majority nationally, would favor government incentives to encourage sustainable farming practices that protect the environment. So that's a goal that people are already on board with. So they're already on board with the sustainable practices. You have about half who are on board with limits on subsidies to the largest farm businesses. Then we tested a whole set of additional information and statements to see how people responded. I'm not going to show you all of it, but just a couple of examples, one in particular. And this is a sort of a message that brought together a lot of the themes and examples and facts that we found were most persuasive to voters. And this is one of the most powerful ones that we tested in the survey. It's a paragraph long, and you can extract and do more things with this in terms of communications. But just as a sort of a bottom line for what direction do we want to go, we found this to be a very convincing message to voters. 87% found this to be a convincing message. 60% of Americans, all Americans nationwide, found this to be a very convincing message. That our current food policy isn't focused on our health, it's focused on money. We put profits before our health and continue subsidies that help keep junk food cheap and drive up chronic health problems like obesity, diabetes, and even cancer. The goal of our food systems should be to produce healthy, affordable food that is accessible for all Americans, that protects our health, our workers, and our environment, provide humane treatment of animals, and that will protect our local farmers and keep them farming their land. We need policies that recognize that healthy food is a necessity, not a privilege. So some fundamental statements of values about focusing on health rather than money, and that healthy food is a necessity, and some examples of policies of the direction we need to go. Quite powerful to voters to put that together. And we found not only did they rate these messages highly, but if you go, the initial attitudes we measured here, in terms of favoring a new direction for national food policy, that these increased. So we started with 50% in favor on this first question, limits on subsidies to large agribusiness, went up to 58%, to 57% after the messages. The initial 75% in favor of encouraging sustainable farming practices up just slightly. You didn't have as much room to grow there since most people are already on board, but it went up to 78%. So you saw an improvement, a shift, even within a 10-minute, 15-minute survey of people hearing some new information and moving in a positive direction. We broke it down. There's lots of analysis in the reporting on this, and again, I'm just giving you highlights here, but we found, again, widespread favorability for that message statement I just showed you, and particularly intense response, positive response among certain groups of voters. There's a partisan difference. Democrats more supportive than Republicans, not surprisingly, but very intense response among Democrats and quite strong with independents. Latino voters in the country, very, very positive on these issues, very pro, very convincing response on this message. Women and younger voters in particular, all even stronger response than we saw elsewhere. Just quick description of the methodology. Again, we did these 6 focus groups, 3 states around the country, national survey, and I should mention we did this in conjunction. We do public opinion research for candidates and issues mostly on the left side of the spectrum and Democrats. We worked, however, with a Republican polling firm as well, Bellwether Research, and we did this as a bipartisan project to really capture the full range of attitudes and views in the country. So that's a few highlights, and we can talk more about it, I'm sure.
Thank you. And we'll have plenty of time for folks to ask questions of any of our panelists as we get through it. So next we're going to hear from Urvashi Rangan, who is with Consumers Union and does a lot to protect consumers as well as understand where they are. So Urvashi.
Thanks, Scott. Hi, I work at Consumers Union. It's also Consumer Reports magazine, and I run our safety and sustainability group. I've been there about 17 years. I'm a scientist. I'm an environmental health scientist, but I'm also really an advocate, and I try to marry those two things. I'm responsible for our tests and how they're conducted, but also how we frame the messages, how we frame our conclusions, how we tie that into policy analysis and the gaps that exist out there, and then how we frame press releases and sort of hit the ball out from those things. And like any work we do press releases on a lot of the different investigations that we run, and I'm going to talk a little bit. We pitch to people like Tom Philpott, who's sitting to my right, who works for Mother Jones, and I always know to go to Tom when I have a complicated story, because if it's complicated, I need a really good reporter who's going to get it out there and get all the little pieces in there and really niggle at those things. But I also do the morning shows that are live, and I have to summarize everything in 2 to 3 minutes. Or sometimes Kappy Lee and Hoda on the Today Show, and how I make BPA fun for people in between the jeans that look best on everyone and like penguins on the stage. So you know, I think communication is not one thing, right? It's really multidimensional, and I like to think of those things and how we're going to target a certain audience, or reporters are our audience too, including our own reporters at Consumer Reports, and how we want to frame something. And I always say, I want to say the strongest thing we can, rooted in science, that's accurate, and no more and no less. And that requires sort of crunching the data and knowing what the results are, but then taking that and deciding how we want to frame that for people so they can understand it. And I think we've done a number of focus groups too, and it's really interesting to see how people deal with really harsh information like arsenic as a carcinogen in the food supply. You know, it's a very difficult discussion to have. And so how do we have that discussion with people? People can take in so much at a given time. You can't learn the really bad thing, want to be an advocate and hit all the email buttons. People just don't do that in a day or in an hour. And so how do you almost layer information out for people? I think of these things as more of a communication journey and not a kind of blip on the radar, because these are really hard issues and they're not easily summarized in a soundbite or a tweet. And we need to be able to provide that context to people while not overwhelming them, and in a way that's manageable for people. And our sort of rubric is you give the bad news, but you have to give people something to empower them, something that puts them in the driver's seat so that they feel some level of control, and that's choice. So it's sort of what's the bad news, what are the cautionary tales of our investigation, what's the context behind them, and for that I mean whatever we study, we try to draw these bigger concentric circles around it, and I'll give some examples in just a minute. And then what are the choices for consumers? What can they do now? And then what are the longer term choices or policy changes that need to be made, and what are the advocacy efforts that need to be done around that? So in the last 2 years, we've looked at beef, ground beef in the food supply, and in most of the meat we've done pathogens, bacteria, antibiotic resistance patterns on all of those things. And then we segment most of our sample pools in all the projects I talk about between sustainable and non-sustainable, so that I as a scientist can try to put some underpinning and quantitative reasoning behind why sustainable is better. So can it be safer? Can it be healthier? And when you can prove those things, that goes beyond the choir, and that's where we think we can move the masses, is by quantifying the benefits of sustainability. And so in all the meat studies, beef, chicken, turkey, pork, shrimp, we look at, sort of find the more sustainable samples in the marketplace, compare them to conventional, and be able to statistically say something is better in a certain area than another. So in our beef story, for example, I brought beef reports and pesticide reports for anybody to come down and take. We showed, for example, grass-fed beef has less E. coli, it has less Staph aureus, and it has less multi-drug resistance in the bacteria that we do find. Those studies cost us anywhere from $250,000 to $300,000, and I don't know how those studies get done necessarily. We've talked a little bit earlier today, they were talking about research dollars, and it's really hard, and if you don't have those research dollars, you can't run big studies like this that give you a statistical pool so you can really say something that, hey, grass-fed actually produces safer beef. And so I just want to put that out there because it is such an important point, I think, in terms of resources and driving that discussion. We also looked at GMO content versus labeling. Natural, organic, non-GMO labels and how those stack up, and natural, and I'll talk about the natural label in just a little bit. We've done things on caramel color and a carcinogen that's found in caramel colors that are used in sodas and colas, 4-MEI, and we were able to do cancer risk assessments on those. And then arsenic in rice, arsenic in juice, and really driving that discussion. It's one that FDA is very squeamish about, and it's one they don't like having, but it's one they're putting a lot of our taxpayer dollars behind to do research on, and we need to hold them accountable to do that in its fullest and do their full due diligence on that. And we also rate labels on foods and try to steer consumers toward those that mean much more and those that don't. And I'll just say that sustainability in general is a spectrum, right? To say something is sustainable is a little bit of a cheat, because there's so many different things, and you can get graded in different ways on very different criteria. So we grade, for example, meat labels on probably 20 different criteria, for feed, for drug use, for pasture that's raised there, for how they're slaughtered, how they're transported. And when you look at all the labels in that space, you can start to see the differentiation among them. American Humane Certified is not the same as Certified Humane, is not the same as Animal Welfare Approved. They all add value over the conventional baseline, but they are not the same thing. And in that way, how we incentivize the market to get people in at some level and move them up the spectrum over time is really important. And people understanding those differences in value is also really important. So we provide all of that information for free because we think it's a public service that people really need to know about those things. I'm sorry, I'm not even talking in this microphone. So I guess the other thing I just want to kind of finish with, and Tom, maybe we'll just sort of pick up on the thread afterwards, is where communication goes wrong, because it does go wrong. And when we put things out there, it's so important for us to control the message, because once somebody gets a hold of something, or like, oh, Consumer Reports and your junk science, the whole discussion gets thwarted somewhere else, and then you can't have the discussion you want to have. And we do that in lots of different ways. One thing is making sure that headlines are true to what the report is. And I think, I know I've seen a lot of headlines out there that fly by that say, organic brown rice syrup has arsenic in it. And that came out of Dartmouth, I remember. And those guys are doing great work on arsenic in rice and rice syrup. And but that was the headline. And so everyone picked that up as, oh my God, organic brown rice syrup is a real problem. But it's not organic brown rice syrup, it's just brown rice syrup. And organic or not, it's a problem. There was another one, and Tom can talk about this too because he covered it. Organic milk contains phthalates. But that was really based on the plastic lines that are used in milk and processing. And again, it wasn't about organic, it was about milk and milk processing. And so even in our own reporting at Consumer Reports, I tussle a lot with the editors. When we did our chicken study, they wanted to really amp up the problem. And there is a problem, and we want to talk about that. But they wanted to call the chicken radioactive. It's just like radioactive chicken. And I kept saying, I can't go defend that. If somebody asked me out there, Dr. Rangan, why do you call it radioactive? I'm not going to tell them to stick it in a lead box in their closet. It's a pathogen, and you want to cook it off. So arguing a lot with our reporters, and sometimes with Tom, just about kind of where we see the needle falling, and you don't want to go, you can't amp it up, and you don't want to amp it down, is really important. When we did our beef story, our editor wanted to put on the cover the most dangerous bacteria on the planet found on beef. And I just, I start going apoplectic and running around the building saying, you cannot do this. It's an incredibly important story. You cannot do this. It will distort and change the discussion out there to be about how we're hyping this up. We want to talk about problems in a very measured way and in a very true way, and be able to offer people alternatives and try to communicate the gradation of those alternatives out there. And if we don't do that, we're really, I think, doing a disservice to this whole movement, which is how do we move the dial up. I'm just going to give two more examples and then give it over to Tom, which is, we all know about antibiotic use. Everyone's talking about it here. It's a big hot topic, antibiotic-free, which, by the way, is not a term the USDA allows, and it should be raised without antibiotics. That's actually the terminology. Antibiotics are really important, right? And we know there's a whole problem with them becoming less effective in people. There's no question that that's a public health crisis. But why we use antibiotics in healthy animals on a daily basis are for a couple main reasons: to promote their growth artificially, to prevent disease in healthy animals, and to increase feed efficiency so we don't have to feed them as much food. And the sad part is we have 450 drugs that are approved for use in animal production. It's not just antibiotics, and lots of them do those same things. So we can get rid of antibiotics if that's what the goal is, and really reduce that use. But if we don't change things like hygiene, require space for animals, deal with stocking density, deal with manure management, then we just shift use over to other chemicals on a daily basis. So things like ractopamine, which is also called Paline, it's an asthma drug. It's like clenbuterol. We give it to lots of different animals for feed efficiency. It's got one of the highest animal mortality rates out there. It kills more animals than any other drug. It's ludicrous that we use this. Many people don't know about it. When I spoke at a grass-fed farming conference at one point, most of the grass-fed farmers out there didn't even know about it. And so it's really important, as we sort of try to bridge this divide, for those who are doing the right thing to know what the wrong things are going on, and to really help people understand some of the fundamental reasons why we do these things, so that we don't do other stupid things when we stop doing one stupid thing. And so that becomes really important too. GMOs, I just want to say, I think the discussion's been largely on safety. As a scientist, I cannot convince you of the fact that they are unsafe. I cannot, the information is not there. I have my gut feelings. I'm waiting for science to come out. I think the work done in France is really compelling. But I can't tell you for certain that there's a safety problem. What I can tell you is the constellation of issues, like if a farmer gets polluted, they pay for it. If you're an organic farmer, you pay twice because you get decertified. If that thing is different enough to patent, it should be different enough to label. So I'd like to sort of think about presenting that constellation of issues to consumers, because some people aren't buying the safety argument, and they're not going to operate even in an abundance of caution. Sort of, I want to feed the world, why shouldn't we do that? And it seems like a good technology. But if you maybe consider the vast array of issues, I think that's how we have a better chance of moving the mass market toward a more sustainable production system, and that's really our goal.
So next we're going to hear from Tom Philpott, who's a journalist with Mother Jones. If you don't know who he is, you should, and if you care about these issues, he's the person to read. There's not anybody out there who covers these issues better than Tom, and Tom's going to give us some perspective because he's on both ends of it. He's trying to communicate to people in his journalism, and then folks like Urvashi are trying to communicate to Tom, and so he kind of sees it from a couple different angles. So Tom.
All right, thanks for having me here. I think I am going to tell a story that, kind of a realization that I had recently that kind of clarified for me what my role is. I mean, I'm a journalist, so I'm sort of, I don't have a particular message that I'm trying to get across, but I'm trying to figure out what's going on in food and ag from the sort of, I feel like I'm kind of driven by the old-fashioned afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. That's sort of my driving, that kind of old school journalistic mode. And I was doing a story recently on antibiotics, and one of the things that came up in this story, it's actually just come out in Mother Jones in the magazine, and one of the things that came up is that back in 1977, the FDA was just on the point of banning antibiotics for growth promotion. Antibiotics that are commonly used in human medicine would be eliminated by this new rule. And they revoked that rule at the last minute. They didn't revoke it, they shelved it. And it turned out that people on the Ag Committee in Congress, let the message slip that if you pass this rule, we're going to defund the agency. So what sort of went on to ice for many, many decades. And over those decades, animal production intensified, antibiotic use doubled and tripled and doubled again, just kept going up. And I'm just trying to figure out, what was the agency thinking? And I was talking, I can't even remember, but I talked to a bunch of people for the story, and I was talking to one of the NGOs that covers it. And one of the things about the story is that it's about Purdue and its decision to pull back on antibiotics and sort of experiment and see what happened, and its sort of journey moving away from antibiotics. And I was asking the guy, as a lot of you probably know, the FDA, after decades of not really doing much at all, they rolled out a voluntary program 4 or 5 years ago, where they're asking companies, both meat companies and also the pharmaceutical companies, to not use them in this way, but they left huge loopholes. I don't want to get into the whole thing, but it's voluntary and full of loopholes. And I was asking this advocate, well, now that Purdue's sort of shown that it can be done, might the agency go back behind and actually regulate? Because obviously poultry is starting to turn, but the other species, pork and beef, are not. So we're still seeing antibiotic use in this world rise. And he said, maybe, and the reason why it really kind of struck me, it was that the way he described it, the FDA makes these decisions based on a cost-benefit analysis, and we're talking about the sort of true cost of food and true cost of accounting. They make it on a cost-benefit analysis, and if Purdue showed that they can be removed and the companies can maintain profitability, then the costs of a policy change go down, and maybe it changes the equation. And I thought really hard about that. And so here we are, so doing this reporting, I think I had the conversation last year, so it's 2015. It's nearly 40 years after the decision was made and not to actually ban antibiotics. And so 40 years after that, for those 40 years, they've had this cost-benefit analysis that said, oh, it would just cost too much to make this move. And I thought, well, what's really going on here is that the industry is completely able to define both the costs and the benefits. And the benefits, we've heard them all before. Cheap meat, feeding the world, Americans love chicken, Americans love meat, and so these are the benefits. We brought, meat consumption with it. And the costs are defined as the profitability of these companies. And so the kind of little epiphany I had is that part of my role as a journalist, and I think definitely what you do, Urvashi, and what a lot of us do maybe in this room, is documenting and redefining what those costs are. And also documenting and redefining what those benefits are, because the alleged benefits of cheap meat and widely available, people eating meat 3 times a day and 20-cent chicken nuggets, these are a very, very dubious benefit when you look at it. But the industry has been able to drive that conversation and basically been able to get their message across to the regulatory agencies. And so I just kind of realized that a lot of what I do and have done in the past and kind of focused for me going forward, a lot of what I'm doing is critically examining that equation, picking it apart, showing other costs besides the bottom line of this company. And it just kind of like stunned me that the antibiotic-resistant crisis that Urvashi alluded to that's killing thousands of people each year, it's hard to document, this is one of the things that's hard to document exactly what contribution meat production makes, but we do know that upwards of 80% of antibiotics that we use in this country go onto meat farms, and there's a lot of resistant strains that used to be associated with hospitals that have left the hospital and they're out there in the community. There's all kinds of ways. It's actually kind of an industry smokescreen to say that you can't tie the loss of effectiveness of these drugs to these meat practices. But just the way that the industry has been able to define that question was really profound for me. And that was the equation. And so now that this company has proven that you can do it profitably, now maybe they'll act. And so, I just wanted to sort of toss that out there as something, maybe a kind of a way to focus communication strategies. And it is kind of a way that I've learned to focus my journalism since then. One other thing that I want to, there's a couple of other things that, strands that that Urvashi put out that I want to pull on. One of them is exactly what she was talking about, the GMO debate. And I think that there was a decision, we've had these email scandals where this US Right to Know group put out some FOIA requests and sort of uncovered a lot of public university professors working closely with these companies like Monsanto and Syngenta and some of their industry groups. And one of the things that was uncovered by in those revelations was that the industry made a very conscious decision to do 2 things. And one of them was they realized that the emotional debate as it was playing out was not going to be good for them. And that bringing out, there's one of the scientists in the email says, why don't you bring out some farm mothers on farms that do GMOs and say that, I feed my kid GMOs and it's just great. My kid is, doing just fine. And the industry flack writes back and says, no, that's not going to work. What we need is scientists. What we need is you to go out. And so to get these scientists, the thing about scientists that I think is really important to know is that, well, first of all, there is no sort of pure, clean, completely apart from industry and apart from the economic system science. Science, like everything else, like journalism, like everything else we do is embedded in the economic system, and so it needs to be interrogated. And the second thing is that what a lot of scientists do, not environmental health scientists being an exception, they they hyper-focus on one thing and aren't very good at and aren't trained at taking a broader view and putting things in their context. So the strategy, I think, was let's get some very narrowly focused scientists, not microbiology, but molecular biologists, certain kinds of plant breeders, and let's bring them out and make them spokespeople, and then let's focus very narrowly on safety. Let's ask a question, and I think this is going to get to my second point too. If I eat this GMO corn, am I going to fall over and die? And if the answer is no, then debate over. Science says that it's safe. Science says that it's good. Go away. Stop it with your concerns. And I think that another part of our job is to broaden and contextualize that whole debate. And I think that the suite of things around, I am starting to see GMOs as just sort of this one. I was actually just at Monsanto last Friday, so 5 hours there, and I'm starting to see GMOs even more so as just one part in the sort of constellation of industrial agriculture that isn't even. I think they're actually moving away from it a little bit, but it's just one thing in this cluster of techniques and products and sort of money-making operations in industrial agriculture. And to isolate it and to sort of demonize it, I think, is to lose. And I think what you've got to do is broaden the context of it. And that gets me to my final thing, and that is the whole problem that Urvashi and I both struggle with, of describing the whole acute versus chronic, things that toxins that are acutely damaging, that literally are poisonous, that you will keel over and die from, versus ones that do their damage very slowly in ways that are very difficult to show and demonstrate. And I think it's really critical for us as communicators to take on that challenge. Because if we don't take on that challenge, then things like that, the debate can get really narrowly focused on: is this pesticide that's showing up as a residue on this vegetable, that's showing up at the parts per million level in water? Is it really a problem? No one's dying from it. Or something like arsenic being a classic example. And we know from our kind of pathetic national health metrics that there are all kinds of factors out there that are ruining people's health. And it's really important to communicate, and really difficult to communicate them effectively, because the headline writer always wants, and the headline writer within the writer himself or herself, and also back in the home office, always wants to put the sensational headline on, but those kinds of things aren't given to, they're complicated, and maybe we can have that as a topic of conversation on the panel. How do we communicate things like that in an effective way that hit home for people without sensationalizing or overselling? Because every time a story gets oversold, then some flack somewhere is cheering, because it makes everyone who writes about this stuff look bad. And I have been tarred with the same brush as people that say, if you eat GMOs, you're going to get cancer next week. I mean, that's probably a character. There's probably no one who says that, but there are people who way overblow the safety angle of GMOs, and I sort of end up getting tarred with that brush as someone who looks at it from a kind of more contextual, holistic frame. And so with that, let me just go ahead and pass it on to whatever's next in the program.
Yeah, so before we take questions, I wanted to dig into one of the questions I was going to ask before I turn it out to the audience, was exactly what Tom hit on. In an era of 140 characters and small sound bites with everything, the complexity that Urvashi hit on, kind of the nuance that Tom's getting at, like how do you all deal with that when what we're talking about with GMOs, with antibiotics, there's a lot of nuance to a lot of this message, and it's not just this is good, this is bad, and how do we deal with that?
Well, I mean, we study sort of public perception and how people hear these different kinds of information, and in the end, to enter the conversation, to connect with people, simplicity is more important than complexity, right? That in the end, because there are all these different forms of communication and technology, it's a connected world, but it's a very distracted world, and people have a million different things going on coming at them. So, and of course, the temptation is, okay, well, it's sensational headline or whatever. What's the thing that breaks through and becomes clickbait? And there are lots of people figuring out how to do that. But if you do want to build a movement, if you want to get people engaged at a level where they say that, this is one of my values, this is something that I care about, I will act on, I will vote on, I will ask I will inquire about it when I'm trying to figure out, who to support politically. It has to be it has to be simple enough that people understand it, on its face. Like it isn't, you don't have to read a book, or you don't have to have an incredible amount of time to understand it. So it has to be simple in that way, but then with with an acknowledgement of the complexities. People know that these are complicated issues and complicated problems. They fundamentally, I think, do know that. So that's what we hear when we can have a deeper conversation, when people can talk to us about it in a focus group or another, that type of research. So it has to connect to that broader understanding and to that complexity that we all acknowledge here, while still expressing the essence of what it is in a way that's simple and connects to sort of fundamental values that people care about. And that's, it's easy to say and hard to do.
We're always challenged with trying to take somebody that we're documenting and explain the essence of what they do, what they believe, in the most compact, portable form possible. And I always use the adage of the game that children play called telephone. If you can't reduce it to something that's clear enough that the next person can explain after they've got it, then you've got an information problem and a messaging problem. And I often find myself telling stories to people that I meet after I've witnessed something and seeing what it is that they gravitate to. And many times it's a very good indicator, children and adults alike, of what's going to stick with somebody, what's going to make them, what's going to be that light that goes on. Because I feel like, in a way, if you can get down to the essence of these ideas, you're really planting thought bombs in people that might not go off that moment, but it's information that once they have, they're never going to be able to get rid of.
And I'll just add to that I think, for these very complex issues, deconstructing them in a way like a Harper's Index, so what are all the preposterous things about it? So in arsenic, for example, we tested arsenic in rice, we tested arsenic in juice, and I remember saying to people, it's actually not, this project's not even about arsenic in rice to some degree. I mean, yes, rice has it, yes, people should moderate their consumption of that, but what does arsenic in rice have to do with chicken? And there's a soundbite. Or what does it have to do with a golf course? And what it has to do with that is that we used to feed chickens arsenical drugs for decades. We'd feed them arsenic, and then we take their fertilizer and move it around the food system and fertilize things with it. We just compound it in the system. We use arsenical pesticides on cotton farms, on rights of ways, on golf courses. So trying to get people to connect those dots in a broader way with sort of the real preposterous bites. But at the end of the day, you need a place to land. You need a place for people to land after they get that tweet that provides cogent and contextualized information. And in a way, that's why even when we do a report in Consumer Reports, I try to do a 50-page report with every one of those. And the reason being is not that I expect everyone is interested in reading 50 pages of it, but then when the New York Times op-ed page takes it and they write an opinion piece, I know I'm getting my message out that much further. And they cited that report when they did their thing on beef. It was, I don't know, cheeseburger hold the salmonella or something, but we couldn't have pitched them to do that. There's no direct sort of pitching to them. It's something that they have to pick up as something important that consumers want to hear about, that's buzzing out there, but that's got some roots to it. And then they're going to need something that informs them on that. It's so, layering information from the deconstructed top lines of preposterousness and humor sometimes too, all the way down to kind of the deep roots of it so that you have that information when you need it. I think is kind of the rainbow of how we really deal with the communication challenges.
I think the gold standard is probably when, how do you get across a very complex, nuanced topic? I think the gold standard in journalism is to do it through narrative, to like hook the reader in through a story, and in the process of the story, the complexities and nuances come out, and the reader's kind of hungry for them, looking for that next detail, because the narrative is pushing them forward. And I think that's the gold standard. But it's kind of complicated because we're also hearing that people don't want to read longer stuff anymore. But I think that a really well-written and well-done piece will draw the reader in and force him or her to keep on reading, even if it's more than 300 words or whatever it is supposedly the limit that people want to read now.
So my last question before I turn it all out to you all is that the theme of this conference is the true cost of American food. And if we talk about what the true cost of American food is, it's huge. There's health impacts, there's environmental impacts, it's a big, hairy mess. And we're trying to get at how we address that and what to do about it, but how do we communicate that to folks? Because the average person is gonna hear, oh crap, my food's gonna get more expensive. Like what this means is making things more expensive, which most people don't wanna hear. So I mean, it's a real challenge that I'd love to hear what you all have to say about that.
I know that when we did our beef story and our pesticides report, we got accused sort of the same thing, and are we just appealing to people who can pay more for it? And one thing that's in the pesticide report that we did was to make sure we could figure out how to communicate getting the most out of your dollar, of your organic dollar, and how to maybe even prioritize it in a way for you, but going to farmers markets, for example, buying things in season, freezing things in the summer so that you have them in the winter, but kind of providing those tips to people for how you can get a better cost, because cost is a fluctuating thing out there, isn't it? And sometimes I see things that are organic and conventional, and they're almost the same price in the middle of the summer. And in the winter, there's a huge disparity maybe, but everything is more expensive anyway. So trying to give people those actual facts on how to get the most out of their dollar while not sort of cheapening what true value is, and which is what our conventional food supply does, and somehow trying to marry those things. As the innovation hits economies of scale, we know we'll see costs go down, but they're never going to be as cheap as what we're seeing. And so trying to help people bridge that divide with other ways of accessing things, and timing and CSAs, those are all really important, I think, pieces of advice.
I think it's a really critical question, and it's something I do think about, and I think one of the great rhetorical advantages of the status quo is that it is the kind of food that we're talking about without this true cost accounting is a lot cheaper. And in an economic system that has all this inequality, it's a very, very powerful lever. And I think that people that are critical of that system have to think really hard about that. And I don't think we always do a great job. And perhaps foolishly, I'm going to call out a couple of people that I respect a lot, that are very respected in this movement, they do fantastic work. But I remember back in I think it was 2008, when the economy was crumbling and there was this big financial crisis. And at the same time, whenever this was, there was a spike in food prices. There had been this ethanol boom and all this speculation, and as the real estate market crumbled, a lot of speculative cash went into commodities, pushing corn and soybean prices up. And there were food riots in the global south, and US supermarket prices were going up. And there's a New York Times piece where Michael Cullen, who, as I said, I consider him to be a mentor, but he said something like, well, finally, people are paying the true cost of food, that their corn and soybean related products are going up. This is probably a good thing. And then a couple paragraphs later, Alice Waters says something similar, and I'm forgetting the exact phrasing of it, but it sounded even more tenured. And I was just like, hold up here. Unemployment has just skyrocketed. We've been in a period of stagnant wages for a long time, and this is just going to put downward pressure on wages. And people are feeling really insecure. And now we've got these two great figures in the food movement saying, well, this is good, and people should be paying more for food. And I think that is not. I mean, I do think that people should be paying more for food, and I do think that the true cost accounting frame is a good one. But I also think that it should not be pushed without looking at the, I'm always going to be saying, let's look at a broader context, but the broader economic system. And I think that instead, or if you're going to make that message in the next sentence, the next breath, talk about we need higher wages, we need things like, I think the food movement has pretty much embraced and maybe embraced more things like the Fight for 15. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers thing down in Florida needs to be covered and thought about very clearly. And I just think that while we're doing that, while we're saying that people should pay more for food, we also need to be addressing this problem. And I think there was a great session about it yesterday, the afternoon session with Anna LePay, about how the people in the food system are the ones least capable, generally speaking, of paying more for their food. And I think that we should be aware of the cruel irony of telling some dishwasher that he needs to be paying more for his food when he or she is just struggling to get food on the table. So I don't think we need to stop talking about paying more for our food or stop talking about the true cost of food, but let's do it in a context of higher minimum wage, more public investments in jobs, more focus on inequality, et cetera, et cetera.
For PBS, we did 24 short films about our food system, and it was fascinating how those subjects were chosen, how things were left out. It was fascinating to see when you try to push something into 24 stories, which ones the ones get told. The one that nobody had interest in telling was true cost accounting. And my wife kept on saying, who's my partner, she kept on saying, but that's the one that we're going to tell. And we kept on pushing it off and not talking about it the whole time, actually having started doing it without saying anything. And when it was all said and done, you can see metrics when you see things. It's the second most watched of all of our films because people know that food is too cheap. You cannot buy a hamburger for 89 cents without knowing there's something quite rigged with the system. I think of all the things that we've talked about today, this is such a powerful graphic because even with the fact that people, as everybody knows, is statistic, there was a time, not even 100 years ago, not even 50 years ago, where people were spending upwards of 30% of their money on food. And now we're at around 8 or 9%, depending on who you talk to. And yet a lot of people still think that food's too expensive, even now. So we can talk about all these gears and levers that we can use to create a more equitable food system, but we even have people now thinking that food is too expensive. So that's the battle that we're up against. That speaks very loudly.
Right. Well, and it has. In the end, we have to be talking about what it is we're going for. If what we're going for is more expensive food, it's not a winning message. But if we're going for food that's safe and healthy and affordable, right, and people have access to affordable, healthy food, and that we have a system that's oriented toward that. People know that our system isn't working toward it because they don't rate our the safety or the sustainability of our system very high. They recognize there are problems, but the description of the goal and the description of the direction of the movement is critically important. And acknowledging, that this is a struggle for a lot of people, or they worry about it, and we have to connect with them.
I just want to add one more thing to these really great points, which is that we also have to include the calorie discussion, right? And I think for beef consumption, for example, in this country is high. A lot of people probably eat a little bit too much beef. That doesn't to say they shouldn't eat beef. And one thing that Jessie Cool, I don't know if anybody knows her name out here, she works with the hospital food out at Stanford, and she actually managed to source grass-fed beef into that hospital by taking the portion size from 4 ounces to 3 ounces and literally not having a cost change in going from conventional beef to grass-fed beef. And so sometimes there's other ways to think about maybe how you can reduce your consumption a little bit to get a better quality product, and I think that's another concept that's really important.
Okay, so now I want to turn it on to you all. Don't be shy. Any questions? Anna?
I'm Anna LePay with Real Food Media, and I was the moderator for the food worker panel yesterday for those who were here. Thanks, everyone. Loved hearing what you had to say. I kind of want to take what you said, Scott, and just kind of go a little bit further, because thinking about, coming out of this conference, kind of how are we thinking about how we communicate this true cost of food, and the sort of following up on what you asked, Scott, I'd love to hear any of you respond to this question of, as I'm reflecting on what we're learning about the true cost, and what you were saying, Tom, about the cost-benefit analysis, and now we've got these numbers to show that we can think differently about cost-benefit. Do you guys feel a sense of, should we all give up on trying to have a reframe around a cautionary principle approach to policy? I mean, are we saying we're only going to be, we've got to look at the numbers, and we're only going to be bringing those numbers forward? Is there still some value? And actually trying to reframe the conversation around caution, around a different approach, which is, secondarily as the daughter of an ethicist, where is sort of the communications around what are just the ethics and the values that we bring in, and not to say those numbers and the dollars and the proof that this is such a broken system and so expensive, but is there still some value in communicating those other kinds of messages? So again, the cautionary principle message, or the kind of ethics and values piece that doesn't bring everything down to the dollar conversation.
It's certainly not what we would, coming out of the research that we've done, and again, it's a starting point, it's not, we didn't find that people were ready to join the movement and sign up and start advocating, but they were receptive, right? That they were open and they shared some of these concerns. But those concerns started with safety and health, right? That's where the most immediate hook and connection is, and then they want to make sure we're still, that they're worried about affordability, they're worried about cost, but we're not going to, the American public isn't going to suddenly all get economic degrees, and we don't need to argue in that sense. We need the New York Times to be able to see the economic research and agree that it's accurate, and that helps set the tone of the conversation for the national media. But in terms of just connecting with people, it's about these fundamental concerns that they have, and we want to say, look, there things here that are affecting our safety, our health. People know that. They get that there's something not right about the direction we're headed in those areas, and that food has, our food and our food policy have a lot to do with that. So that's something we can connect to and start that conversation with. But then it becomes a matter of how much more do you bring in? How do you bring how do you broaden the conversation in a way that moves you toward the policy without just getting lost in the weeds and the density of all this, because it's so complicated.
First of all, it's interesting you brought up the precautionary principle, which you don't often hear spoken about in the United States. When we looked at this pesticide referendum in Italy, this success they had, which I'm hoping Tom will write about, this amazing story about a community of people that had no political understanding of any kind, rose up against pesticide drift in their community, took a little bit of science, a little bit of organizing, and had a tremendous impact. They're being sued by the European Union, by the Italian government. It's an amazing story. We broke it down, to get to your answer, into 3 parts we're making 3 films about. The first film explains in very simple terms what pesticide drift is. The second film very simply explains what the precautionary principle is. And the third film very simply explains what collective action is, so that people can understand how you can go from identifying a problem to actually becoming a driver of the change that you want to see. And so I think that's how we approach things, is like making it super, super simple and telling the story to people who are just like you.
And Anna, I think it's a really great point. I remember speaking at a Society of Toxicology conference last year, which is heavily industry-driven, and mentioning the precautionary principle, and the audience gasped. I remember just thinking, oh my God, I'm totally in the lion's den. But I want to say that I think that people get accused of being unscientific when you use that term. It's sort of like...
Would you define it? Sorry, because would you just...
Precautionary principle, yeah. It's sort of like, given what you know about something, and in the absence of scientific certainty, do you take action to avoid it, to mitigate it on some level, or address it, in some meaningful way. And so it's without knowing for sure that there is going to be harm or a problem. And as someone who tests products, I find myself in this funny vortex sometimes that if I'm staring at a product and looking at a residue on a strawberry or arsenic in a product, that it may not be that that product itself is the problem or the residues are right on the margin of the risk assessment that I can do. And so I realize that if we take it piecemeal by piecemeal and product by product, I'll be dead, my kids will be dead, their kids will be dead, like we'll never get there. And so to some degree, I think about it a little more broadly. And so let me just toss one idea out there, which is the science of resistance. And antibiotics do it and pesticides do it. And antibiotics, whether they're in a soap or a cleaner, whether they're being fed to our animals, or whether we put pesticides on stuff, we're always in a race to the bottom because nature tells us that anything you're trying to kill in that way will become resistant and you will lose effectiveness over time. I think if we can start to take those bigger concepts and throw them back on the people who sort of poo-poo precautionary principle because that's a really unscientific approach, and kind of leverage the theoretical science on them, not the science of the thing on the thing, because I think we'll lose that way. I don't think we'll get enough traction that way that maybe we can change the argument. Or to Tom's point on GMOs, we need to lump that discussion with a discussion about new technologies in food. So whether it's GMO, whether it's nanotechnology, and the next technology out there, whatever it is, that it's grouped as a group of something that we have failures in our oversight system to even address those things. So that's why the GMO salmon is sitting at a veterinary committee at FDA, because we have absolutely no centralized way of even vetting those technologies. And maybe if we can sort of lift the arguments out to these more uber arguments that are hard to argue with, then precaution, I think, could maybe take a better hold. But as a scientist, I struggle with that. I believe in it, and we're not a country that believes in that. We're a country of proof of harm before you do something, not proof of safety before it goes out there. And that's another thing I like to throw at the people who poo-poo precaution, which is you didn't prove it was safe to begin with. So that's what most people think you've done in the first place.
Right, and I think that last point is critical that you just made, that people assume. I mean, I think the general idea, as Anna well knows, is that, Europe, the precautionary principle holds sway generally with exceptions, but it's more of a precautionary principle culture. Whereas here in America, we're sort of cowboys and we just go out and do stuff and we don't want to hold back innovation. But I also think that if people really knew better that because some pesticide has been registered with the EPA or some, for example, some antibiotic has been registered with the FDA since the 60s, that it's somehow been proven safe and vetted. I think if people understood just the extent to which that isn't true, I think that maybe we wouldn't be in these two poles. I think we can, I think there would be huge challenges to getting the precautionary principle to guide, let's say, the EPA here. But I also think that we could go farther along on that spectrum. Like I just did a piece a couple days ago about these fungicides that were introduced, these pesticides that attack fungal pathogens that were introduced early 2000s and just exploded over the past 10 or 12 years in use. And there's this trail of a study here, a study there, a concern there. There was a big in vitro study that came out a couple weeks ago about a couple of them. And there's this evidence building that they are doing more than just killing funguses out there. They may be doing these other things. And the thing about it that I found to be stunning was that I mean, they just came through and were accepted. The companies deliver a couple of studies, and the burden is on the EPA to say, okay, this is harming other non-target insects or creatures in general, or it's harmful to human health as used. The burden is on the EPA to say that very rapidly, and if they can't say it, then it gets registered. And so that is our system, and there's got to be some kind of middle way between the precautionary principle in its sort of purest form and completely throwing caution to the wind and throwing this stuff out there into the environment and onto food without any real comprehensive testing, and putting really the burden, the kind of key point here is that the burden is on the institutions themselves, the EPA and the FDA or whatever, to find harm, and if they can't find it very rapidly, then by law they have to pass, the way that our system is set up, they have to pass it. And meanwhile, they don't have adequate funding, they don't have the sort of facilities to do a lot of toxicity testing, and so it just doesn't happen. And I think if people knew that, we could have more. And I just really, I wasn't making any kind of plea for the cost-benefit analysis. I was just sort of seeing it as reality. And if it's a reality, then let's broaden the conversation around costs and benefits and not let the industry define it. I was not making a case against the precautionary principle in general. And I do think that I'm skeptical that we can ever get there, but I do think that we could go some middle way where at least people know what the system is and there's some kind of testing before stuff gets thrown out to the environment.
In the back?
Yeah, I'm Roger Lawson at the Farm to Table Talk podcast, and this has been a great discussion. I want to applaud the attention to context, and I want to ask you about the GMO example, because that's one where people have got really simplified focus about labeling. And let's just imagine that tomorrow labeling was the law across the country. I think what you both on this side were alluding to is just the beginning of a new chapter. That some of these technologies that are on the drawing board, and Tom, you said you spent some time at Monsanto, there's a whole range of things that might not even be GMO. So all these technologies are coming, but we won't have the benefit of having people rallying around a labeling law. And so in a way, I don't even know how to ask the question, but because it seems like it underscores what you're saying, the challenge of trying to have people understand that and understand what the implications are. And I just wondered if you might kind of add another comment or two on that of what happens next. What's kind of like this battle on technology and your role after GMO?
I mean, I think the post-GMO world is coming rapidly, and I think there's a lot of technologies that are going to be defined as non-GMO, that are going to be really kind of sped up breeding, gene editing, stuff like CRISPR-Cas9 and gene drive. And I think we're entering a brave new world with that. And I don't know what's going to happen with that, but I do think that that it's really important that we as journalists and citizens ask a lot of questions, demand a lot of information, and try to move the spectrum somewhat on the precautionary principle, and have a conversation about it before the stuff sort of takes over the food supply. And it definitely is true that Monsanto is doing a lot of things besides GMOs. One of the things that they're doing, this is going to kind of spoil a story that I'm working on to describe my trip a little bit, is they're working on these microbials for the soil. And so the idea is, I talked to these two guys in the division for microbials, and it was like talking to Sir Albert Howard, the guy who kind of codified organic agriculture half a century ago. We're talking about the biodiversity in the soil and how many there's a trillion, you pick up a handful of soil and there's a trillion microbes, and we're just learning about the science of this, and we're going to improve productivity of agriculture with it. We've got these new products, and they were just going a mile a minute, and they were showing me this case of products. And there are these corn and soybean plants behind this case, and they really had me going with it, like, yeah, this is going to be great. Although actually I was very skeptical that they can sell I'm skeptical of human probiotics as a sort of thing, and I'm also skeptical that some agrochemical company is going to figure out what microbiota to put in soil and sell it to you. So I was skeptical, but I was going along with them. I was trying to understand what they were getting at. And I looked closely at the case, so there's like 6 of them. And they had names, like I can't even remember what the names were, but under each of these sort of brand names, there was like Extendra, I don't even know what. Under each of them, it said, and I have a picture of this, it said fungicides and insecticides. And so I did a double take, and I said, so this product that you're selling, this microbial division, why do they all say fungicides and insecticides on them? And the guy explained to me, oh, okay, well, what they are is they're seed treatments. And we could do a whole panel on seed treatments. But they're seed treatments, and they have an insecticide, they have a neonic insecticide in them, and they've got a fungicide that I think was the fungicide that I had just been writing about. It's licensed by BASF, another agrochemical company. But they have this magic pixie dust. Well, he didn't say it like that. But they have these microbes in it, and what happens is that the plant, as the seed grows, it takes up the insecticide and fungicide, and the microbials fall into the soil and enrich it and do all this great stuff. And so even in that division, that they're trying to do this, Sir Albert Howard idea of the teeming biodiversity of the soil, it's a way to sell fungicides and pesticides. And then, so I asked the guy, I said, well, do you sell it apart from this? Do you sell the stuff? And he said, oh, yeah, of course. Here's a bag of it. And he showed me the bag, and I don't have the names on them, but it was 2 soil microbes that are very common soil microbes. They're found everywhere. It's sort of like, hey, I've got this great new thing. I want to sell you this probiotic. It's called acidophilus. Well, I can go get a thing of yogurt and get that. Like, it's sort of already ubiquitous out there. And so, I guess the point of my story is just to sort of maintain skepticism in the face of, these sort of concessions to the idea that chemical farming isn't the be-all and end-all. And, I couldn't have written that better myself, that the concession was literally embedded in the chemical farming. So yeah, I guess going forward, more skepticism. And yeah, there's a brave new world coming. I don't know where it's going with CRISPR-Cas9, but I do know that I'll be trying to figure it out and be asking hard questions about it.
Other questions? Yeah.
My name's Karen Leibowitz. I just started a restaurant called Good Perennial here in San Francisco, and my role is sort of messaging. I've definitely set a challenge for myself to be positive. Part of it is because I'm a business owner. You guys are not, but I am hearing to some extent a kind of sense that you need to give some kind of upbeat spin, or at least a sense of choice. And I am also hearing from Tom maybe a contrary point of view of being skeptical, or getting the full story. And sometimes that story is not positive. I think if you are especially telling a story of community access to healthy water or something like that, it's not going to end happily in most cases and stuff like that. And so I guess in terms of the messaging that you all are doing in different realms, maybe it's an American orientation also to sort of find the happy side of it, but I'm wondering, is the true cost of American food story that we're telling a happy story?
Well, yeah, if I could address one aspect of that, which is, and this is a principle in general for, to the extent that we're talking about, this is political communication, we're trying to engage people in what is essentially a political act, are you going to make different decisions, both in your, perhaps, in your behavior and how you choose food or whatever, but also in, the policies you support, the people you support who are actually making the decisions that shape this whole system. right? And it's just a general principle when, that the effective, the message here, the better, the things that work to make people have to feel that they have some power, some efficacy, or they give up, right? There are lots of things that I don't like about the world that I feel in the end I can't do anything about. Like that's a sort of human, and so all right, well I won't deal with the things I can't do anything about. People have to feel like they can do something, like there is a path to something better that they can be a part of, or they'll put it in that box of, okay, one of the many things in life, bad things in life I can't do anything about, and it's in the interest of those who are powerful and make tons of money off the way things are now, to get them to feel disempowered, right? To push you say that this is just the way it is. You can't. So yes, it's critical, I think, for that communication and the messaging to. Sure, it's got to be real and talk about what's wrong and talk about what needs to change, but it has to contain that element of hope, or it's not going to move. It's not going to work, right? It's not going to connect to anything that people can take action on.
I have a 9-year-old, and when she was really small, 2, 3, 4, you read all these little books, about how to be a good parent. And they always say for every one thing you say to your child about what they need to do to change, you've got to give them 10 compliments, because if you keep on telling your child everything that's wrong, then they're going to tune out. So when we started our project, my wife made the decision that we were only going to focus on solutions. So if you're going to talk about a problem, you have to embed the solution around it, and because any solution is actually talking about a problem. And I find that we live in, for the most part, in what I would call this crisis cult culture, where people do books about how horrible CAFOs are that actually are going to get one person to shift their thinking about CAFOs, because all they do is it's like crisis porn. It just shows people problems in amazing color photographs that don't do anything. People are turned off by the horrors of things if they don't see, the pathway to a solution. It's the problem that happened with the climate movement. The symbol, the logo of climate change is a polar bear on an ice floe. Now, you don't know what you did to get the polar bear there, or what your responsibility is to get the polar bear off there. And so that's the problem that we have, is that we often are so quick to point out the problems when the solution is actually the harder thing. And just to close, the quickest examples I can give you is when we went to Iowa with these kids to look at Iowa's water quality and the impact of industrial farming on Iowa's water supply. What was really amazing about it was, first, that 4 kids, their parents pulled them out of the class immediately, because this was in Iowa, of course. But the other thing was, when we had our first sessions with the students, we explained to them that while we were going to talk about the problems with industrial farming, 75% of the work that we're going to do is on solutions to these problems. And I think that that's where it's the best place to put your energy, is on exposing the problem and then immediately getting towards mechanisms that can actually create the change.
And I think in your case, you have this great opportunity, because people are coming to your restaurants, they want to eat something good. So that they're coming at it from a place of positivity. You're offering a choice. So let's say you're offering wild salmon from Alaska on your menu, and that's what you're offering. I don't know if it's this amazing opportunity to help educate somebody on all of the problems with farm salmon. And it's not to say you need to put that story on the menu, but if someone asks that, well, so why is it wild salmon? Why should I care? Or you're highlighting, we're making conscious choices here to offer you these things. They taste great, and they're just made a lot better. It kind of gets people where they're at, and it's not this sort of force-fed, pardon the pun, kind of thing. It's coming from a place of wanting really good food and then appreciating what that really means. And there's so many opportunities, even in that space, to educate people around that. Or when I think of shrimp, and I think about how 90% of our shrimp comes from Southeast Asia, and when we did that test, 5% of the imported farm shrimp had illegal antibiotic residues on it. There's such an opportunity for organic shrimp produced in this country. That war is going on now in the National Organic Standards Board. It's been going on for 5 years. The salmon industry has tied it up. And so we don't have an aquaculture standard for California, for the nation. In California, you actually have a law banning the use of organic on aquaculture until the Fed set standards. It's something we actually worked on when we realized it was going completely awry. And we in Food and Water Watch actually worked on that here. But all to say that it's a place to educate consumers, it's a place to activate consumers on certain issues, and you're sort of in pole position to do that. And I think you should think of it more of it as an exciting role, not a burden and not something that's.
Actually, I completely.
Oh, good,
agree.
okay.
That's
You
like-
sounded worried, and so I just wanted to say, I think it's.
I feel like it is an opportunity, and it's why we are trying to use a restaurant as a platform to spread this message.
Which is a great way,
Just to say,
yeah.
like, oh, there are better choices, and actually certain kinds of food can actually be good for the environment and not just less bad, and it's a really optimistic
It's
message, and that's like what I have kind of immersed myself in, like in trying to message and to talk about solutions and options and all that. And then just for the last couple of days, you know, I'm also like, but then when you realize like what a small part of the food system it is, it's like, it feels a little overwhelming. And then also like always coming back to the economics of it feels really hard because as a restaurant owner, you know, you're sort of like up against the cost of food, and if you make all these choices about like choosing foods that make better impacts, then you get Yelp reviews that are like, the meat portion was tiny and the whole thing was too expensive. And it's like, yes. And then how do you then feel about sounding like Michael Holland saying like it's a good thing that you can't afford it, you know? How does it not end up being elitist? So yeah, it is definitely an opportunity, but I'm also just like trying to be also accurate to the reality.
Yeah.
So we're over time, but maybe I'll let one more question in, and this panel I know will stay here all day if we let them. Sanju, do you have a question? And then with that, if you all have some parting thoughts as you answer the question too.
A really quick question. I'm wondering how all of you guys balance the political and legal sensibilities to actually, and I know Tom's answered, to call out corporations. I mean, in this conference, there hasn't, unless I missed it, there hasn't been a real discussion about the true cost accounting of the negative impacts of businesses. We had Howard Shapiro on a panel talking about how Mars doesn't message to kids. And it's like, I'm kind of missing that here. I know each of you deal with it in your own way. And Scott, you too, from the funding standpoint, how do you like balance the dedication to truth that you have to the reality of getting in trouble?
That was for you.
Well, I should just point out that
He doesn't want your answer.
the research director, or maybe slightly former, she's still at Mother Jones, Maddie Oatman, who is responsible. She now edits my stuff, but before she was doing that, she's back there. Raise her hand, Maddie. She was responsible for fact-checking at Mother Jones, sort of overseeing the research department. And it is a very huge question for us. We got slapped with a lawsuit recently that was very frivolous. You can look it up. Nothing, thank God, that I did. But the reporter who did do the thing didn't do anything wrong. It was just a total slap. And that reality is out there, and we do think a lot about that. And whenever I write something, or anyone on staff writes something that is legally sensitive, which essentially calling out a corporation is, or you know, raising quite public health questions about a product that a corporation puts out, you can bet that it has been vetted back and forth. That corporation has been contacted and asked for its response, and that response has been published in there. So yeah, but we do it anyway. But we take these precautions, and that holds us to a standard of extreme accuracy, of not going beyond. This is something that Urvashi and I talk about sometimes, not going beyond what the evidence says, of stopping where the evidence stops, and letting that, whatever that corporation is, have its say.
And I'll just echo that. We in February, we have a campaign to ban the natural label, and there's a comment period that FDA has open until May 10th. And you can sign that petition on our site, and you can go to FDA and make comment. We think it's really important. And in February, we featured 25 major branded products that were claiming to be natural, that we thought there were lots of ways in which that was misleading consumers. It wasn't illegal. It was just incredibly misleading. So if Weston Oil's jamming GMO oil extracted with hexane, but you don't know that from the bottle, and it's 100% pure and natural, we called it out. Kraft shredded cheese and wood cellulose in it. What we did though, because we knew, we were talking to our external relations and the communications department, even before I began the research project, we decided on an algorithm with how we were going to contact each company and vet. Literally give them an opportunity to say something, give them an opportunity to respond. If they didn't respond, we were at them 2 more times and described our methodology of contacting them. After 25 major branded products, it was on Good Morning America, it was on all the national news shows, not one company came to us to say anything because it was all true and they couldn't really fight it. Sanjay, your film highlights consolidation, I think, and Food and Water Watch. I know you guys work on these issues that are so important, and it is possible to target at a higher level and hold these companies accountable, and it is an important discussion that we should have because the control of that cost is in the hands of very few, as you well point out, Sanjay, and they have the power to actually change things as well. And I learned from your film about the 5 supermarkets. There's 5 big supermarket chains in this country. That's it. They own all of them, and that's shocking and startling, and it's also a way to be very targeted, to your point about companies and targeting them to do things. And it's an important lever we have to keep in mind for all of this.
But not to completely, I don't want to disagree with you both, but I think at the same time, you could be like Buckminster Fuller and you can say, you simply create a different system. You don't have to fight an existing system. You just create a different system that takes its place, and I can certainly agree with that. But at the same time, I'm really happy that Howard came. I'm really happy that he came to this conference, and I think that the change is going to, Howard started in Seeds of Change. They were bought by Mars. He was brought in and brought his culture from Seeds of Change with him to Mars. If you want to create the change, you're going to actually need to work and engage those people at those large companies in these conversations. And I'm just really glad that Howard came, and it'd be great if other leaders of other companies also would engage in these conversations. Otherwise, where are they going to be exposed to these new ideas? Where are they going to get inoculated? How is that going to happen?
If I could quote the great progressive leader Mitt Romney, he said, "Corporations are people, my friend." Those are, in fact, people at those organizations, right, making those decisions. They have incredible power. It's real. We have to recognize it. We have to call it out, right? And we were the GMO question came before, the labeling, and whether that was, a good strategy or not in response. We did the polling for the GMO labeling initiative. It was on the ballot in California in 2012, I think, and it was a very popular idea. It's simple. That's one of the reasons it's popular, and giving people a choice and empowering them. And it was an expression of corporate power and resources that the millions of dollars that came in to defeat that and run all kinds of misleading messages. So on the one hand, okay, yeah, so we took it. You take on corporate America and you lose. On the other hand, the fact that they spend all those resources tells you you're probably onto something. And maybe labeling, as simple as it is and as limited as it is something that poses a real threat to that system, and so that's an indicator. So you look for those, you make progress where you can. You look for those indicators for where you're actually changing the system and undermining it and moving it in a better direction, and then recognize that they don't always win. There are victories here and there, and you look for how you put those together into moving things in a direction, and that can include corporations making better decisions. I think we heard a lot already in this conference and this morning about certain companies making better decisions about where they're going to go. Doesn't mean the system's fixed, doesn't mean that there isn't entrenched interests against it, but obviously all these folks are still making progress where they can, and that's real.
Well, with that, thank you for your patience. I'm sure all of our panelists would be happy to talk to any of you if you have questions individually for them afterwards. And just join me in thanking this amazing panel.